two, 1, 2. So, thank you all for coming out to my master's recital. This is both a performance and lecture recital based around the music of Lee Konitz, more specifically his composition that we just played for you subconsciously, in which we played both the head and the solo of that tune. And that solo comes from when he first recorded the tune in 1949 with players such as Lenny Tristano, Warren Marsh, and many others. I remember first encountering this music around my junior year of my undergrad, where some of the faculty members of my undergrad were playing the music of Konitz, Lenny Tristano, and Bill Evans. And at the time, I thought it was cool and inventive music, but just due to the complexity of all the different phrases, I dismissed the music for a couple of years until sometime last year I became interested in Lee Konitz and Lenny Tristano again. And after taking a look at his very first record subconsciously, as well as other records that he did afterwards, I found that there's some really great things to talk about. And in particularly, as you could tell by the title of this presentation, Melodic Lee, we'll be discussing in particular the melodic concepts of Lee Konitz, as his melodicism, the way that he approaches melody, is the one thing that makes his playing distinctive. And there are other players, of course, that have that same approach as well, but the way that he does it is different. And we will be discussing that as we go through it today. So with any artist that we take a look at, I think it's important that we talk about Lee Konitz a little bit, his life as a person and a musician. I find it interesting that the more I take a look at these great jazz musicians, the more that I realize, man, many of them are born in the same state that we're currently living in right now, which is great. But he was born in Chicago, Illinois, and I find that to be very interesting and such a coincidence, because that also happened to be the birthplace and living place of his mentor, Lenny Tristano, who was a blind pianist that ended up having a bunch of different students as his followers. His parents were Jewish immigrants. He had 2 older brothers, and much like other jazz saxophonists, he picked up the clarinet at around the age of 11, being inspired by swing jazz clarinet players around the swing era, such as Benny Goodman and Artie Shaw, who at the time were leading the great jazz orchestras of their own during that time. Now this is interesting because Lee Konitz is primarily an alto player, but he actually would pick up the tenor saxophone next and not the alto. And the main reason for that is because he was inspired by the likes of Lester Young, who was one of 3 great tenor players in the swing era, the other 2 being Ben Webster and Coleman Hawkins. So around his teenage years, by the time he would pick up the alto saxophone, he would start playing in clubs around Chicago, And this is where he would first meet Lenny Tristano after Tristano watched him play at one of the gigs, and Tristano would give him the offer of taking lessons with him, which Konitz would gladly take the offer. And these lessons were around 1943 to 46. And in 1946, Lenny Tristano would move to New York in order to expand his teaching and musical performance career. But this was a good opportunity for Konitz to expand his career as well, as in 1947 he would play with the Claude Thornhill Orchestra. Now, Claude Thornhill's orchestra was one of many dance bands around this time, and what made his orchestra unique is the arranging for that group, which was a very impressionistic style of writing. But he was there from 47 to 48, and that is where his earlier recordings come from. Some notable examples are Anthropology and Yardbird Suite, as they both demonstrate his legato approach to articulation and his pure dark tone. But then, once he disbanded with the Claude Thornhill Orchestra, he moved to New York, and this is where he would be exposed to many different great players around that area, notably Coleman Hawkins, but of course Charlie Parker, who was one of two players that would pioneer the genre of bebop, the other person being Dizzy Gillespie. One other notable thing is that when he moved to New York is that he would contribute with Miles Davis and his arranger Gil Evans on a record titled Birth of the Cool. And he was one of the primary voices of that record, contributing a great number of solos on that record. And then, of course, his main reason for moving to New York is because he wanted to continue his lessons with Lenny Tristano. And by this point, Tristano already acquired many other students, including Billy Barrow on guitar and Warren Marsh on the tenor saxophone. And this is where they would perform in many clubs together, and they would record Lee Konitz's first record, the title of his composition that we played, Subconsciously. That was recorded between 1949 to 48. But some of the notable compositions that are listed here, which he contributed the majority of the compositions in his first record, but they include the likes of Subconsciously, Soundly, Ice Cream Konitz, Tautology, and Rebecca. One notable thing about these three tunes is that they're marked in parentheses as they are based on other previous tunes. These are known as contrafacts, where you take the chord progression of an already established tune and you write a new melody based around that. And we will talk more details about that when we get to Subconsciously. But the other thing to know is that, yes, they have very punny names, which is something that Tristano and Marsh and many others were known to do for their tunes. Are they very bad puns? Yes. But do I approve of them? Absolutely. And I want to talk about a little bit, because when we're talking about someone like Lee Konitz, because like he started his career around the mid-40s and he passed away in 2020, he influenced many different people, and he collaborated with different people that were already established artists, or they were just about to make their way through the door. Some of the more notable examples include the San Kenton Orchestra in the 1950s, his dear colleague Warren Marsh, since they contributed a lot to Lenny Tristano's music. Bill Evans is another notable example, as he's another Tristano student and great pianist and composer. And then I also listed a couple records that he did in the 1960s. The most notable one being Motion, which is a trio record that he did with bassist Sonny Dallas and drummer Elvin Jones. And Elvin Jones was already part of John Coltrane's quartet by the time they recorded this. The Lee Konitz duets is another great record, as it's just duets with many great players, including Joe Henderson on saxophone, Jim Hall on guitar, Marshall Brown on the valve trombone, not the slide trombone. But those are two really great records, and there's many others. But I wanted to highlight this because he's recorded many records as a leader and as a sideman, which means he's really helped to influence and inspire a lot of people through his sound and his playing, which is super important. And I thought it was worth mentioning regardless. So again, when we're talking about different players, you know, the first thing that we gravitate towards is the sound. And at that time, Conant's had a very distinctive tone. If we were to compare it to the likes of Johnny Hodges and Charlie Parker, who were great alto players, Johnny Hodges had a very expressive and wide vibrato to his playing, like a vocalist. And then Charlie Parker had a much brighter and aggressive tone, but also very expressive. Conant's was kind of the opposite during that time. He had a very pure, dark, and even tone across all the registers of the saxophone. What made his timbre unique, though, something that is not that noticeable in his first record, but it's more noticeable when you take a look at some of his later records, is that his high register has the timbre akin to a soprano saxophone, and his low register has more of the timbre of a tenor saxophone. And I feel like that's super interesting because in some of those later records, he would pick up soprano and tenor saxophone sometimes. So sometimes it's hard to tell whether he's playing the alto or not until you get to some of those registers where it does sound like an alto. So it's very interesting. But in regards to Konnitz's technique, this is where his lessons with Tristano come into play. And this is taken from him from an interview that he did with Andy Hamilton in his book called The Art of Jazz Improvisation, which is a really great book interviewing Lee Konitz, and I highly recommend it. But their lessons, which is also something that Tristano worked with all of his students, is playing arpeggios of all inversions and qualities, rhythmic patterns such as 3/2, 5/4, and many others. Harmonic theory, articulation, and inflection, which include the likes of non-legato and legato articulation, and then seeing recorded solos, playing them, and writing them down. Now, if this sounds like anything that you learned in your jazz lessons currently, congratulations, you've learned lessons 101. I find this to be interesting as we think some of the stuff that we're learning today is brand new concepts, but Tristano was doing it all the way back in the 40s. And the only reason why it hadn't been established yet was the fact that jazz wasn't really part of the institutions quite yet. It took a while. But this leads into something that Tristano would work on for all of his students, which is contrafact writing. Or as they like to call it, they call it line writing, as this isn't the type of writing where you're writing a repetitive song or a songbook form type of song, but rather you're writing a song in order to better improvise over the chord changes. And this is something that Tristano did with all of his students. So in the case of Subconsciously, it's based off the changes of a song called What Is This Thing Called Love. It was composed by Cole Porter in 1929 for a musical called Wake Up and Dream. Now Cole Porter is one of many songbook composers from his time, and a lot of jazz musicians would pull tunes and even make their own contrafacts over those tunes. And What Is This Thing Called Love is a pretty recorded standard by Cole Porter, not just for vocalists, but also instrumentalists as well. And before we go any further with it, we will play for you now the melody to What Is This Thing Called Love, as it'll be important to recognize the melody when we get back into Subconsciously. One, two, one, two, one, two. It's a standard songbook song, and of course, this song originally had lyrics since it was written for a musical. But it's a very repetitive melody, not having too many leaps, mostly rely on stepwise motion. What's interesting about this song is the G dominant 7 sharp 5 chord. And the reason that chord is there is because it highlights one of the notes in the melody, which is the D sharp. And this is an important distinction I wanted to point out, as that chord is actually removed when we get to subconsciously. So speaking of that, this is subconsciously, or as I like to call it, Konnetz's homework, because that is essentially what all these tunes that he wrote for, including Soundly and Ice Cream Konetz, they were all homework assignments that Tristano would do for all of his students. In fact, this was, I think, the very first tune that he had to write for his earlier lessons with Tristano, which I think is very interesting. But we'll play for you subconsciously now. And unlike before, we'll do it in a little bit of a slower tempo, as there's a lot more notes to process. 1, 2, 1, it's a very notey melody compared to What Is This Thing Called Love. I do want to go over some of the changes to the harmony. And this is actually very interesting when we're talking about Konetz's tunes in particular, because Lenny Tristano and Warren Marsh, when they wrote their tunes, they would make dramatic changes to the harmony in order to have it fit their melodies. And while that the same philosophy still applies to subconsciously, it actually only applies for a couple of chords, mainly the F minor major 7th chord, which beforehand that was just an F minor triad, and it just highlights one of the changes to the melody, which is an E. And then for the case of the G dominant 7th chord, the sharp 5 has now been replaced with a flat 9, as it highlights the flat 9 that is used regularly in the melody. But it also utilizes a scale that he actually utilizes quite a bit with this tune, the half-whole diminished scale, which is a sequence scale of half steps and whole steps. And we'll talk more extensively about that when we go through this tune and the solo phrase by phrase. They both utilize similar concepts. But in terms of the melody, this is the most dramatic change when compared to subconsciously. So there's a great utilization of bebop language now. Now, a lot of contrafacts that were written in this time, such as the ones that are written by Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, and Tad Dameron, the thing that's interesting about them is that, like, even though, if we're talking about Charlie Parker's in particular, where, like, it's still a very virtuosic style of writing, but it still relies on the songbook form. There's still a form of repetition of the melody that's there. That is not the case with subconsciously. It abandons the songbook form. In fact, this is handled, as we like to call it, it is a through composed tune, where you write new ideas every few beats or every few measures. So there are constantly new ideas with this tune. And there is a form of repetition, which we'll go over, that's kind of hidden in this tune. But some other notable things is that I mentioned the scale qualities. You know, he utilizes the half-whole diminished scale a lot. But one thing he likes to do is he likes to play around with the rhythm. He likes to start a lot of his phrases on the offbeats, which is very interesting. And as I've mentioned, it's written like an improvised solo. which is the whole point of Tristano's tunes, is learning how to play over standard chord progressions. So now we'll play each section of the melody phrase by phrase, so that way you get a better idea of some of the concepts that he's going for. So the first A section. 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, so let's take a look at the phrase that is in blue first. So the first 3 measures utilize the C half full diminished scale, which for context it sounds like this. Now, he utilizes some of those pitches from that scale, but he also utilizes pitches that are from the F jazz melodic minor scale. And the jazz melodic minor scale is a major scale with a flatted third. So instead of it's now. And these are both scales that he utilizes a lot for the melody of Subconsciously. For the phrase that is in yellow, it utilizes a different half full diminished scale now, the G half full diminished scale. And that's the same case for the phrase that is in pink too. The interesting thing about the phrase that is in pink is the ending note, which is an augmented fourth over the C major 7th chord. So, how do you play the C major 7th chord? It's a very tense resolution. But the reason for this tense resolution, or what helps to resolve it, is the fact that he actually continues to use that same type of tense resolution throughout Subconsciously. And the other thing too is that while the augmented fourth is a tense resolution, it is by all accounts an appropriate choice when playing over a major 7th chord. If we're talking about ending it on an augmented fourth rather than ending it on a perfect fourth. So there's a very noticeable distinction there. Now, we're talking about all these different scale qualities, but in regards to the rhythm, all of these phrases start on the offbeats. Even when you talk about some of the smaller interconnecting phrases that are there, all of them start on an offbeat. None of them start on the downbeat, which makes it rhythmically interesting. And of course, with the utilization of the half full diminished scale, we have a great utilization of approach tones, chromaticism, and stepwise motion. Now, talk about the second A section of this tune. We will play the second A section. 1, 2, 1, 2. Okay, so there's some different elements at play there. So the first phrase that's in blue, it's actually a variation of the first phrase from the first A section, but the way that it's handled, it's the difference in the rhythm. It has a much more sustained feel. So the first phrase is, but then the start of the phrase in the second A section is, has a much more sustained quality to it. The same philosophy applies for the phrase that is in yellow, which utilizes quarter note triplets. But unlike that phrase where, again, it uses stepwise motion, this one utilizes a little bit more of the leaps. And tonally, it borrows pitches from what we call the alter dominant scale, in which case it's the C alter dominant scale, and that is the 7th mode of jazz melodic minor, and in which case for the C alter dominant scale, that is the 7th mode of D flat jazz melodic minor. And then the phrase that's in pink, it just borrows notes from the F jazz melodic minor scale. It's just a very short phrase. Although now we're starting to see phrases, the phrases that are in yellow, pink, and orange, those phrases start on the downbeats now. So there's a change in rhythm that's there. And then the phrase that is in orange, it starts to utilize pitches from the C major scale, but then when we get to the phrase that's under the G7 flat 9 chord, it uses two different augmented triads. The first one being a B augmented triad and the second one being a D flat augmented triad. And it gives it a way more open sound. The only thing that helps to bridge those two arpeggios, bridge the gap between those two arpeggios is the 2/8 notes in between there. And then the ending to the last phrase, as you've already heard, is the same augmented fourth resolution that we see before, but the way that we resolve it is just a different approach. So now going over to the B section. One, two, one, two. Okay, so the phrase that is in blue, this is a great utilization of what we call a 2-5-1 line, in which case it is a 2-5-1 to B flat major. But what makes this phrase interesting is it only utilizes notes from the F half whole diminished scale. And really what makes it interesting, besides the great utilization of half steps and approach tones, is the shape of the phrase. You know, it winds and weaves throughout that entire progression, which is very interesting. This is actually one of my favorite lines from that tune. But then the phrase in yellow is a very great departure, where it uses entirely perfect fourth intervals, which gives it a very open sound. Now, besides that, those last two pitches at the end, that's a perfect fifth resolution. But it gives it a very ominous sound to it, and that is very interesting. The phrase that is in pink is kind of similar to the phrase that is in blue, as it also utilizes the A flat, well, a variation of the half whole diminished scale. This time it uses the A flat half whole diminished scale, besides those last three pitches at the end of the G7 flat 9 chord, where it utilizes pitches from the G half whole diminished scale. And again, the thing about this line, to compare it with the phrase that is in blue, it's all about the shape of the line and how you approach it. And then moving on to the last A section of the tune. 6 times for this one. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. This is something that we will talk about when we get to Konetz's solo later, is yes, these phrases are long. This phrase that is in blue is like 4.5 measures long, which is crazy to think about. But the thing about the phrase that is in blue, just to take note, is that it utilizes a lot more chromaticism and not necessarily just relying on pitches from a particular scale. Although he still does that with the C half whole diminished scale in the first couple measures before transitioning into pitches that are part of the F jazz melodic minor scale. But the phrase that's at the end there, he uses that ending phrase in order to start the phrase that is in yellow, which utilizes different pitches. It has a different approach to it, but it kind of goes for a similar idea. And that is very interesting as well. And again, it doesn't just stick to a particular scale. It utilizes a lot more chromaticism. And that ending pitch that is there, the A flat, that is a different type of tense resolution, in which case that is the flatted 6. But as we've already established, Konitz seems to end his phrases on very tense resolutions, which, you know, if you're going to stick to a certain idea, you go for it. Now, when we compare subconsciously now to Konitz's solo over this tune, it may seem as if, you know, they're handled the same way. They seem to be more complex, but as you listen to it and you compare it to subconsciously, it is a very striking difference. But before I play Konitz's solo, I'll be playing Charlie Parker's solo over what is this thing called Love, as he's a great demonstration of a different type of melodic player with different melodic concepts that he uses. So what's this thing called? 1, 2, 3, 4. So that's Charlie Parker's solo over that tune. So now we'll be playing Lee Konitz's solo. It's slightly different changes, but it's more than less the same tune. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. So yes, it seems very complex, but there are some notable differences that we will go over. So before we play like the first A section through, just to change the pace a little bit, his first phrase utilizes pitches besides the A flat that is there. It mainly utilizes pitches from the C half whole diminished scale. But the thing about this phrase is that it is one continuous motion. Besides the last phrase that's in the end there to help turn the phrase around. But it's one continuous descending motion. And then this almost the same philosophy applies for the phrase that is in yellow. It utilizes the G half whole diminished scale with some approach tones in there. But the thing that makes this phrase different from the phrase that is in blue is that it winds and weaves throughout the changes. It just doesn't, it's not a continuous motion, it is both ascending and descending, and it has a different resolution because of that. So, first section. 1, 2, 1, 2. 2, 3, 4. So, that is that phrase. Now, the phrase in the second A section, the phrase that is in blue is probably one of my favorite Konetz patterns, period, where he's utilizing a pentatonic scale, specifically the major pentatonic scale, but he's modulating chromatically down. Now, when we talk about the pentatonic scale, the major pentatonic scale in particular only uses pitches from the major scale besides the 4th and 7th scale degrees, hence the name, penta. But when we talk about pentatonic scales, we kind of talk about in terms of being more of a modern concept due to players like John Coltrane prioritizing them. But you'll look at some of these players from the earlier jazz period, and they were already trying to utilize the pentatonic scale in certain ways. Now, the first two measures are a G major pentatonic scale and a G flat pentatonic scale, but the phrase that is towards the end there utilizes pitches that are more fitting for the F minor major 7th chord and helps to end the phrase. And as long as these phrases are, you've got to end it at some point. The phrase that is in yellow is very interesting as it utilizes quarter notes instead of eighth notes now, but it only utilizes pitches from the first 4 notes of the G half whole diminished scale, and it's treated as a hemiola, which goes over into the phrase. It continues on into the B section. So just to play for you the second A section real quick. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. But that phrase the phrase that was in yellow, it continues over to the B section, which this phrase is nearly 5 measures long. But the thing that makes this phrase unique is besides the B that is in the beginning, it's just the B flat major scale for the most part, besides the last bit of the phrase where it utilizes pitches are more fitting for the A flat 7 dominant chord. But it's a big contrast compared to the phrase that we were talking about with Konetz's written B section earlier, where like the utilization of the F half whole diminished scale had it so that way it had a great utilization of approach tones, which make it more interesting. And that's certainly true, but as long as you have a great shape and contour of the line, you don't necessarily need to utilize it all the time. And he doesn't utilize it here. He just utilizes the B flat major scale, but what makes it interesting is the shaping of the phrase that he does. The phrase that is in blue is another phrase that continues over into the next A section of Konetz's solo. And it utilizes pitches at first from like the C major scale before utilizing pitches from the F jazz melodic minor scale, which in the context of the G7 chord, it is appropriate, as you could kind of treat this as another variation of using pitches from like the G half whole diminished scale. So just to play for you the B section real quick. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. And then going over the last A section of the tune, again, it's another continuous phrase. This one features another type of sequence similar to the pentatonic phrase, except it utilizes a different concept, which is arpeggios, specifically 7th chord arpeggios that are approached by an approach tone, a chromatic approach tone for each phrase. gives it a certain amount of tension and pull for it. And then the last phrase that is in yellow, again, a phrase that's like, what, nearly 5 measures long, 5-6 measures long. It just utilizes pitches from the C major scale, besides the A flat that's in the beginning there, because it's under an F minor major 7th chord. But again, it's all about the shape of the phrase and not necessarily the notes that are being played. So, playing that phrase for you real quick. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. That is the final phrase. But here's the thing: there's something that we haven't covered with Konnitz's solo yet, and this is in particular to the recording session that he did for his very first record, and that is the trading sequence that he does with Lenny Tristano and Billy Barr, who were also part of his first record and were also soloing over the tune. So to play the trading sequence for you really quick. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3. So the reason I wanted to talk about this certain section in particular is that I think it does a great job summarizing some of the concepts that we've been talking about today in terms of like Konnitz's approach to solo sequences, which is actually, let me pull up the other slide real quick. So the phrase that is in yellow is another sequence-based pattern where he mainly uses pitches from the B flat major scale with some approach tones, but he starts with a scale, and then before he repeats that sequence, he uses a major, not major 7th, but an arpeggio that goes up to the 7th of each chord before repeating the sequence again. So the first part is and that starts there before we get it back into the pattern again. And then the phrase that is in blue is very interesting as it utilizes pitches from a different type of melodic minor scale. So the first measure is E flat melodic minor, G flat melodic minor, and then F melodic minor. But what makes the utilization of this phrase interesting is that he's starting and ending on pitches that are not the root and the third. So the E flat is the 5th of the A flat dominant 7th chord, with the D acting as the flat 5th, and then the G flat is the 7th of the chord, and then it ends on the 13th, and that's a similar concept to the next measure, unless if you were to count it as another repeated sequence. He actually resolves that last measure of that phrase with the root, but under the G7 chord, it starts on the 7, ends on the root. If he were to continue that sequence, he would resolve it on the 13th, which is something that he did in the previous measure. But it allows him to start and end on pitches that are not the root or the third, which is very interesting. So, to summarize some of the concepts that we've talked about today in terms of subconsciously the head and the solo, let's talk about similarities. So, both of them utilize a certain sequence of approach tones. This mainly goes for the half whole diminished scale and a little bit of the augmented scale, but not too much, as well as the major scale and the jazz melodic minor scale. But there's a heavy use of bebop language for direction and outlining the harmony. Although, for outlining the harmony, you could put a little bit of an asterisk on that, because the thing about Subconsciously, the thing about Konitz as a player in general, is that he was a very melodic player because he was very much influenced by the likes of Lester Young, which, if you don't know anything about Lester Young's playing, he was a very melodic player. Same case with Charlie Parker, because he was also very much influenced by Lester Young. You check any of his recordings that he did in the late 30s, early 40s, you can hear that influence in his playing. But the way that Konitz does it is a little bit different. But the thing about outlining the harmony is that when Tristano first met Konitz, he didn't have that much knowledge about harmonic theory. He didn't know much about studying or reading different chord progressions. He truly was an improviser, and he was just really playing stuff that he was hearing. But that was what made Tristano gravitate towards Konitz, the fact that he was actually an improviser, and in his words, more akin to a free improviser, which is super interesting when we're talking about Lenny Tristano, who experimented with free jazz quite a bit. But he doesn't outline the harmony too much. You know, it's all about straight, stepwise, melodic lines for the most part. But the thing to compare with both the hen and the solo, although this is more applicable for the solo, these phrases are long. They are very long. They are longer than most Charlie Parker solos, honestly. When I played that Charlie Parker solo for you from what is this thing called Love, which was recorded in 1950 for a string record that he did, his phrases weren't that long. They don't really go for more than 3 measures at most. Konitz, it's like 4 measures, 5 measures, maybe even 6 measures for him. And for him, it was all about practicing all these different patterns and approaches that he was working on when he was studying with Tristano. But of course, when we're talking about differences between the hen and the solo, the phrases that are in the head, as we've already discussed, they are different in length. And again, it's more so handled in the way of a through composed tune. The other way I like to think about Subconsciously as a composition too is that it almost seems like the phrases that are written are like pieces of a puzzle that you put together, where like you take one phrase, put it there, you take another phrase and put it there, which is another form of composing. And an example I would like to use for that is if you know anything about Nobuo Uematsu, video game composer for the Final Fantasy franchise, one of the tunes that he wrote for one of those games, One Winged Angel, was the only tune where he took bits and pieces of phrases and made a tune out of that. That is the only way he's ever composed that. Now, am I saying that Konitz composed subconsciously in that manner? No, but it's nevertheless interesting to think about, and it's another great utilization of composing that you can use. But in regards to like the head and the solo, you know, the head, like all the phrases are different in length. You know, there are different variations of phrases. While the solo had more eighth note phrases. They are way more stretched out. Each and every one of them may have been different in length, but by and large, you know, they were all some variation of one continuous phrase. And the thing about the head too is that it had less repetition, but I will say in regards to the head in terms of its repetition is that the repetition doesn't come from repeating a certain melodic cell, but rather repeating a certain type of sequence that he uses, like how we took a look at the first phrase and the first A section, and how every phrase that was composed for that first A section started on an offbeat. That is a form of the sequence that you can use. But the solo had more repeated sequences. And while there were new ideas that were being introduced for every phrase, there were way more sequences going on, and it is something, nevertheless, to point out when we're talking about subconsciously both the head and the solo. And that pretty much concludes the end of the presentation, but we are not done yet, as we will be performing, I guess, our own take of subconsciously. I'm not sure if we'll do Lee Konitz in the original recorded justice and applying a lot of those concepts, but we will certainly try. But before we do that, I have some thank yous to give out, as putting a recital like this together can be taxing sometimes, but you always got your backbone and support group, in which case it is these amazing people right here. So performing with us tonight is Will Lawn on guitar, Shuai Yan on the piano, Victor Serta on bass, and then Brendan Backstrom on drums. It's great working with them because all four of them are actually involved in groups that I'm involved with this semester. So they come from both of those groups. Some is simulation of the different groups that I perform, which is great. Also, another hand for Shuai for setting up the live stream for me, for anyone that's watching the live stream. And then for Victor Serta, because an hour and a half before my recital, he was playing in someone else's recital. So an extra hand for him, because that's not an easy thing to do. But I want to thank all my colleagues for coming out and for supporting me, listening to me perform and talk about Konitz. He's certainly a really great player, and I had a great opportunity performing and learning from all my different colleagues here, which is great. And then I have thank yous to give for all the teachers that I've had the pleasure to work with at my time at the university. That includes the likes of Professors Jim Pugh, Larry Gray, and Joel Spencer. But with me tonight are the two saxophone professors I've been studying with the past 2 years, Ron Bridgewater and then Professor Chip McNeil. Give them a hand. And then I just wanted to thank Chip in particular, because without his help, I wouldn't be here in the first place. You know, he was one of the people that was able to get me here into this, into the jazz department, and allowing me the opportunity to study with all the different teachers and colleagues here. So I really appreciate it very much. And then last but certainly not least, I always have my backbone with me and supporting me, and I will never shut up about this until the day that I die. But I want to thank my parents not only for coming out and supporting me, but also supporting my musical endeavors as well. They really have done a lot to support me for my career and for my life as well. So thank you is just not enough. So I very much appreciate that. But yeah, thank you all for coming out. And now we will play for you subconsciously. One, two, one, two, one, two. I'm not gonna waste this pun for nothing. Thank you again. Donald Lee was written by like. It's the thing whether it's written by Will Smith or John Perperon. Yeah, I think it's not. Yeah. No.
You see where I was going with that?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Indiana, Donald Lee, back home. Indiana.
Right.
Thanks for coming.
Oh! Yeah. Dude, I wish I could go to that. It was great. It was really good.
Yeah, it's because of Curtin Truck. You see, like, yeah, I was glad that you were there because I knew you would get that.
But which reference are you talking
One winged angel from Final Fantasy
Yeah.
VII. Cause like
You said that, I'm like,
he
no.
he he